Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmiri inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on U.S. and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. Polaris Live, by the way, is in its third year of operation, and I want to thank our global leadership for your confidence in our unbiased global coverage of the most consequential relationship of our time and its impact on the world. Now to the subject of our program today. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, by 2025, Africa's household consumption will total $2.1 trillion. By 2050, the continent will be home to over 2.5 billion people. Experts predict that it will soon be the largest business opportunity since China embraced capitalism. Africa's land area is larger than that of China, the United States, India, and all of Europe combined. So winning hearts and minds in Africa is a prime national interest, yet over 2 decades, it is China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, that has helped Africa's infrastructure establish business connections. My guest today, with his unique background, is singularly qualified to help explain why this is so. He is professor of the American University in Cairo, has a PhD from Cornell University, served as a Foreign Service officer in Senegal, U.S. Defense and Marine Attache Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, the Cape Verde, U.S. Embassy in Senegal. As U.S. Defense Attaché in Dakar, he watched as the Taiwanese closed up their embassy and went home, and the Chinese came back after a decade-long absence. Please join me in welcoming back to Polaris Live from Cairo, Dr. Mark Deets. Good morning, Dr. Deets. How are you today?
Hello, Sarwar. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I am well too. It's a smoggy day. I'm in New York, and all this, the forest fires have been sending all kinds of environmental debris down the East Coast. So actually, people are being recommended to wear masks in Manhattan today.
Oh, goodness.
Throughout the East Coast. So it's a little bit of a crazy, dangerous situation. But listen,
Wow.
Thank you for taking the time to join us, Mark. Let me start off by saying the U.S. State Department says that American policy for Africa encompasses 3 foreign policy goals: security, prosperity, and the creation of a better world. Let's start by hearing about your firsthand experience as to how these policy goals match up on the ground with your posting in Senegal.
Okay, yeah. Glad to be with you again. So, I think that those are fairly consistent policy goals that were also there when I was serving at the embassy in Senegal in the mid 2000s. And it's interesting that that's to kind of compare that with the China's foreign policy, which says that big powers are the key, China's periphery is the priority, developing countries the foundation, and multilateral platforms the stage. So, looking at that and kind of comparing, there are some similarities and some areas in which I think that we can cooperate. And kind of like I said the last time you had me on the show, I think especially if U.S. officials can treat African officials more as equals. And show them the respect that they deserve in terms of talking about these economic interests, political interests, and cultural interests. These things that you mentioned. I think that there's the potential for a lot of good cooperation.
But listen, Mark, as the Cold War ended, America was in a very strong or in a much better position in Africa, as I recall. And what happened there? And perhaps you can tie this into your experience in Dakar, where the Taiwanese moved out, China came in, and just reflect on how America has kind of been shunted aside over the years in Africa.
Well, I don't know that I would agree that we've been shunted aside. However, there was this idea at the end of the Cold War that there should be this peace dividend. That because the United States had won the Cold War and brought about this what was thought to be a new world order, a more peaceful world order, that the United States would naturally lead that. But it didn't need to maintain the diplomatic presence that it had on the African continent. So it began to close down a number of embassies. It also began to close down a number of foreign military assistance programs. And so, some of those places where the Cold War got hot in Africa, like in Angola and the Congo and places like that, the U.S. diplomatic representation in those countries was really cut. And so, at the same time that was going on is about the time that you see the rise of China, at least as I remember it, again, from the standpoint of kind of a mid-level military officer at the time. That's about the time, kind of the early to mid 2000s is when we began to hear these ideas that China was going to be the next peer competitor for the United States in terms of influence around the world.
Right.
And so, as the it's interesting, the timing. I mean, the contingency in this. We historians like to talk about contingency in history and how, the fact that the United States was pulling out at about the same time that the Chinese were coming in to invest in larger and larger ways. To tell you the truth, the Chinese had been investing and becoming more engaged in Africa for quite some time. I mean, ever since the 1971 UN vote to recognize China at the expense of Taiwan, there had been increasing Chinese engagement in the African continent. And then for some reason, and this is where our story in Senegal enters back in, there was kind of, various levels of engagement with Taiwan. And so in the case of Senegal, they became one of the countries that was inviting Chinese assistance in the 1970s and the 1980s. The Chinese built a dam to kind of deal with encroaching salt water in the Casamance River in southern Senegal. And so they were involved in these kinds of infrastructure projects. They also built Leopold Sédar Senghor International Stadium, where up until recently, the Senegalese national soccer team played all of its games, and there were a number of other sporting events held in that stadium. Anyway, that stadium was completed in 1985. The dam in the southern part of the country was completed in 1988, and so the Chinese were there. But at some point, the Senegalese decided to increase their assistance with Taiwan. And so the Chinese kind of left. And this is the kind of the story that I had told you about, where, we had some personal friends from the Taiwanese embassy who all of a sudden in 2005 told us that they were going to have to leave Dakar. And they did. They left quickly and packed up and went home. And then after that, we began to see more and more Chinese diplomatic and business representation there in Dakar.
Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I missed one thing. Why did the Taiwanese feel it necessary to leave?
because the Senegalese had invited China to come back in and have a diplomatic presence, which they had given up at some point in
Okay.
the early 1990s when Taiwan came in. So they started doing business with Taiwan. And then the Chinese had kind of pulled out, even though they just finished building like this dam and the soccer stadium and things like that. So they were the Senegalese were doing assistance with the Taiwanese for quite some time. In fact, before the embassy closed down and they left, they had some Taiwanese Navy surface combatants, frigates, visit the port of Dakar. I went to the ship visit. They had a diplomatic reception on board, and they, so the Taiwanese Navy was there, was participating in exercises with the Senegalese Navy, had that presence, and then that all got shut down in 2005 when the Senegalese decided, they made this calculation to decide that it was in their interest to go with the PRC.
So it was strictly a strategic policy change, nothing that the Taiwanese did not do or the performance of their experience.
Right. No, I don't know why. I just think that the Senegalese began to see more of an opportunity with the Chinese, because by this time they were realizing that China was a growing power, a growing post-Cold War power, and that they made a calculation that it was more in their interest to do business with the Chinese than it was with the Taiwanese.
But
I think it's that.
Let me ask you, a big criticism of the U.S. foreign aid program is that it is underlined by the so-called Washington consensus, free markets, capitalism, free press, and so on. And China's policy, they don't really care how you run your country. They focus on the infrastructure, increasing standards of living, and all of that. Did that play a part there? And what do you think?
Yeah, I think it did. I think that, the Senegalese, even though the Senegalese are very friendly to the West, Senegal was the first Muslim country to express its condolences to the United States after 9/11. And Senegal has been a very strong ally of the United States for years. So I don't want to mischaracterize that, but I think the Senegalese saw that it was in their interest to be able to do both, to play both sides. It was easier to do business with the Chinese in some ways because of the lack of concern about human rights records and free and fair elections and all those kinds of things that the United States normally ties its assistance to. So I think that this was a fairly clear calculation on the part of the Senegalese, and I would imagine a lot of other African countries to do the same. Now, I don't know how many African countries had relations with Taiwan at that point in 2005, but I will say this. When Taiwan first became involved with independent African countries in 1963, I believe there were 13 countries that had relations with Taiwan. That number moved up to 22 African countries by 1969. Today, the only African country that still maintains relations with Taiwan is Eswatini, which used to be Swaziland. It's that little country. It's that little country in the middle of South Africa.
And from your experience on the ground, what do you attribute that to? Is it really as simple as what you mentioned just a moment ago, that China comes in and provides help, focuses on infrastructure, on standards of living, and doesn't bother with preaching about human rights and so on? In our last conversation, I mentioned I'd come across this foreign minister in Africa who said, when China comes to my country, I get a bridge. When America comes to my country, I get a lecture. I mean, does it boil down to that, Mark? Because that should impact American foreign policy then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it, but I don't think that's all there is to it.
Okay.
Like I said, the Senegalese leaders that I worked with and that I met with on a regular basis, these are smart people. These are smart guys. And I think that it was a fairly sort of cold and clear-headed evaluation of what they thought were in the best interests of Senegal. And they decided that it was in the best interests of Senegal to be able to do business with China, not just because of business, but also the whole thing, right? So in terms of, government cooperation, military cooperation, so on and so forth. Now, when I left in 2007, I believe the Chinese still did not have a military attache stationed there, but one was coming. And so I'm pretty sure that they have a military representation there now. Certainly they have military representation in other parts of the continent, which, I think is perhaps one of the criticisms that we've talked about before, that the United States is a lot of its government assistance is coming in the form of security assistance and military engagement with the African continent, while the Chinese are just coming in to do business. Okay, that's false. That's not true. Chinese are also involved with military engagements. They've got a base in Djibouti. They're looking for other places to build ports and to build bases. But they're also running into a certain amount of African resistance. I mean, the United States tried to set up its new Africa command in 2007 on the African continent, and basically there were no takers. I think that the resistance that the Chinese are feeling to some of the basing that they would like to do in the African continent is kind of coming from the same place. But there's speculation that the next base for the Chinese is going to be on the Atlantic coast somewhere of Africa.
Okay, so I want to come back to this, but let me take a few seconds to remind our viewers to be sure and sign up for Polaris Live alerts on our upcoming programs by going to my website, which is kashmiri.com, KASHMERI.com. They may also want to subscribe to our YouTube channel to establish a closer connection with our studio staff. And now coming back to my guest, Dr. Mark Deets from the American University in Cairo. What you've just said, Mark, reminds me of what the U.S. Defense Secretary Gates used to say in his congressional testimony when he went to ask for more money for the Defense Department. He used to always tell them, as I recall, that how is it possible that the American military has more music bands than the State Department has foreign service officers? And he used to say, you got to give more. Do you think there's a lot in that we just focus too much on the military and not as much on diplomacy? Yeah,
I do. I mean, I think you kind of saw that a little bit in the recent debt crisis. This showdown between Democrats and Republicans to see whether or not the United States was going to honor its debts, where you see this sort of gamesmanship and this concern that what's going to happen with the economy. And so, I do think that there's something there, Sarwar.
So which ties into my next question, which is, isn't winning hearts and minds also a precondition for security and all the other relationships that countries that America needs to have with African countries.
Yes, absolutely. To the extent that can be done, I mean, I think that's the first job of American diplomacy. And to go back to your last question, and the reason that I was bringing up the debt negotiations is because there's this idea that the military, like that military spending, cannot be touched. And by the way, I'm not advocating that. I'm not saying that like one side is right or wrong on this, but it's the idea that the defense budget is sacrosanct and that can never be touched. But everything else is fair game, including things like diplomacy.
Yes.
There's this idea that American diplomacy is kind of a nice to have and not a need to have, and that couldn't be further from the truth. We absolutely need our foreign service officers and diplomats and other members of the country teams around the world advocating for U.S. foreign policy and U.S. businesses and U.S. interests. And you can't shortchange that. I agree with the sentiment from Secretary Gates there.
And, Vice President Kamala Harris was in Africa last year when there was a meeting of all the African leaders and so on. And the New York Times wrote a piece on that and about what we're talking about. And one of the points they made was that the unspoken words for American diplomats are that we want you to help us counter China in Africa. That the Times said that just cannot be mentioned. But I read that and I said, well, as you pointed out earlier, the African leaders are not dumb. I mean, they realize what's happening there, right? And so should we be a little more proactive in pointing out all the good that comes out with American backing, become more active, put more money? I mean, how do you think we should go from this point on?
I do think that it's worth the investment to make this an investment in American diplomacy and to be straight with Africans and the rest of the international community in terms of what our interests are on the continent, what we're interested in, and what we're not. And I think that's been pretty clear. I'm not trying to point to like a lack of transparency or diplomacy on the part of our diplomats on the African continent. But it is interesting to think about the influences, not just of like policy, but also some of the cultural influences and the various forms of media and press. I mean, it's a different ball game now than it was in 2005 when I was there. But I remember going to a meeting with the Navy Chief of Staff for Guinea-Bissau, who at the time was Jose Americo Bubo Nachuto. We just called him Captain Bubo for short. And the United States had closed down its embassy in Guinea-Bissau during the Civil War of 1998. And so I was there meeting with Captain Bubo. It was one of the first times that I had met him as the Navy and Marine Corps attaché at the time to talk about our assistance. But the problem was Captain Bubo and the Guinea-Bissau military was basically helping South American drug traffickers trafficking cocaine through West Africa to go to Europe. So you actually had like flights and ships and things showing up in Guinea-Bissau territory, actually receiving like a government military escort to the airport to go to the next place on this. And so anyway, I went there to meet with him and to talk about our common interests. And I there was we came out of the meeting, and there's a room full of press that I didn't know was going to be there. And they asked me what could be expected of my visit, like what would it indicate in terms of a future collaboration between the Guinea-Bissau military and the U.S. military. And so, I was kind of ambushed by this because nobody had told me that this was going to happen. And so anyway, I said basically that as long as we continued to see progress in the civil military relations, which had been a problem in the 1998 war, and we continue to see progress in this area, that the people of Guinea-Bissau could expect continued U.S. cooperation. And so anyway, this went out on RTP, which is the Portuguese news agency. But one of the news agencies that picked it up was Xinhua News Agency, the government news agency of China, which I thought was quite interesting, and it was later posted online. I was worried that I might have said something that I shouldn't have to the press, but my boss assured me when I got back to the embassy that I didn't say anything that was untrue, and I did not divulge any classified information. So I was all right. But that was one of those memorable experiences of my tour there.
It's I want to press a little more as we run out of time here. I want to press a little more on what America can do, and I want to press you a little bit, Blue Sky, on our focus on national security around the world. I mean, we have global responsibilities. America has chosen that path, and so we have a much larger footprint. But I mean, think about it, Mark, that not too long ago, 2 weeks ago, in fact, China had a meeting of Central Asian countries. They hosted a security meeting of Central Asian countries, a huge diplomatic accomplishment. A few weeks before that, they worked out a diplomatic solution between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which no one thought could be done. Right? They're trying now to get actively involved with the Ukrainian situation. So it seems as though China is able to do multiple diplomatic initiatives at the same time, a much wider optic than a lot of people thought. Do you think that we've kind of given up that with this almost total focus on security and military issues? It's a blue sky question, but I think it's relevant to what you've been talking about. And I just want your thoughts on that.
I don't think that we've given up on that. No, I would not say that. I do think that those particular examples that you just threw out, kind of successive events, demonstrates the immense power of the Chinese right now, and the immense global power that they have. They wanted to be considered a great power, and I think they are. I think most observers would agree that they are now, and so it's going to be hard to have international discussions without them being in the room that are going to move the world forward. So no, I think that that's a great demonstration of that. On the other hand, I know there's a lot of people talking about the decline of American power and like all of this kind of stuff, but just in terms of military power and economic power, I do think that there's still a lot to be said for U.S. cultural power. I think we're okay, and I think that the hand wringers need to relax a little bit on this idea that the United States is somehow melting from the world stage. Now, that does not mean that all of these BRICS countries, and especially the Chinese, don't want to change that. There's this effort, for example, to get rid of the U.S. dollar being the currency of exchange for the entire world. So I know we're out of time. That's just one example, but no, I don't think it's time to sound the death knell of the United States in international affairs.
I am reminded of that saying people around the world, when they say Yankee go home, they also add after that, but take me with you. So Mark, thank you so very much again. And as we run out of time here, I want to remind our viewers that we've been talking to Dr. Mark Deets, who has an upcoming book. And we have a link that you can follow to get that. And again, to our viewers from around the world, thank you very much for watching this dialogue. We have a tremendous lineup throughout the next month and a half. And please go to our website and check out the events, sign up for the alerts. Dr. Deets, again, thank you. And it was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Sarwar. It's been a pleasure being with you again.
We hope to have you back again. Goodbye for now. Thank you again, viewers. Repeating myself. Join us again next week, Polaris Live. Until then, goodbye.